I am your host, Miss Marple. Let's begin our journey.
The late afternoon sun, a benevolent orb in the cerulean sky, cast long dappled shadows across the manicured lawns of St. Mary Mead. It was the annual summer fete, an event that for generations had been the highlight of the village calendar. Mrs. Hargreaves' prize-winning dahlias were on display. Children shrieked with delight around the coconut shy, and the aroma of Mrs. Finch's famous lemon drizzle cake wafted from the refreshment tent amongst the gentle throng, observing with an almost imperceptible keenness from beneath the brim of her sensible straw hat, was Miss Jane Marple. Her knitting lay quiescent in her lap as she sat on a bench near the vicarage gate, ostensibly enjoying the spectacle of human endeavour. Her gaze, however, missed nothing, the strained smile of young Mrs. Davies as her husband, the new curate, spoke a little too long with the flamboyant new artist, Mr. Jasper Thorne, the almost imperceptible tremor in the hand of Lady Carmichael as she accepted a cup of tea from the village busybody, Mrs. Bantry, and the way the usually unflappable Colonel Armstrong nervously checked his pocket watch for the third time in as many minutes. The fete was in full swing, a symphony of polite chatter, distant laughter, and the occasional triumphant clang from the bell-ringing competition. Dr. Stone, the village physician, was holding court by the tombola stall, his booming laugh echoing across the greensward. He was a man of robust health and equally robust opinions, a recent widower who had, to the surprise of many, taken to village life with unexpected gusto. He was particularly animated today, regaling a small group with an anecdote about a troublesome patient, his face flushed with good humour and perhaps a touch too much of the vicar's homemade elderflower wine. Suddenly a piercing scream tore through the tranquil air. It was a sound that seemed to shatter the very fabric of the pleasant afternoon, silencing the laughter and still. In every hand, all heads turned towards the vicarage gate, where a small crowd had begun to gather. The vibrant, festive atmosphere evaporated instantly, replaced by a collective gasp of horror. From her vantage point, Miss Marple saw young Sally, the vicar's maid, clutching her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. Beyond her, sprawled half in, half out of the vicarage garden, lay Dr. Stone. His robust frame seemed suddenly fragile, crumpled and still amongst the fallen petals of Mrs. Hargreaves' prize roses. A dark, rapidly expanding stain blossomed on the crisp white of his summer suit, just above his heart. A profound, chilling silence descended upon the fete. The only sound was the distant, mournful bleating of a sheep from the neighbouring field. The sun still shone, the bunting still fluttered. But the light now seemed colder, harsher. The idyllic English village had, in an instant, been plunged into the cold grip of something utterly unthinkable. Dr. Stone was dead, and the summer fete had become the scene of a murder. Miss Marple quietly picked up her knitting. Her needles clicked softly, a rhythmic, almost meditative sound in the sudden, terrible hush. Her blue eyes, though seemingly mild, had already begun their work, absorbing every detail, sifting through the layers of shock and burgeoning panic for the first, faint threads of a pattern. The village, she knew, would never be quite the same. The silence that followed the discovery of Dr. Stone's body was not a true silence. It was a humming, vibrating tension, like a wire stretched to the point of snapping. It lasted only a few seconds before the village of St. Mary Mead erupted into a discordant symphony of human reaction. There were gasps, the frantic sobbing of Sally the maid, and the authoritative, if slightly high-pitched, shouts of Colonel Armstrong, who instinctively attempted to take command of a situation that was far beyond the remit of a retired officer of the British Raj. Miss Marple remained her bench for a moment longer than the rest, her fingers continuing their rhythmic dance with the wool. She looked quite like a fluffy elderly bird, seemingly bewildered by the sudden commotion. However, her eyes were far from vacant. She watched Mrs. Bantry's face go ashen, a hand flying to her throat, not in the theatrical way of someone seeking attention, but with the genuine jerky movement of one who has seen something truly impossible. She also noted how Jasper Thorne, the artist, didn't move toward the body like the others. Instead, He stepped backward, his face unreadable, his eyes darting toward the vicarage windows rather than the fallen man. Slowly Miss Marple rose, tucked her knitting into her bag, with meticulous care, and drifted toward the gate. She didn't push or shove. He simply occupied the spaces people left as they recoiled in horror. By the time she reached the inner circle of the crowd, the vicar, Mr. Clement, was kneeling by the doctor's side, his face a mask of pained prayer. He looked up, his voice trembling. "He is gone. God rest his soul, but I fear this was no accident of nature." "Of course it wasn't an accident, Vicar," snapped Colonel Arm. Strong, his face a shade of purple that rivaled the local beetroot. "Look at the man. He's been shot or stabbed or—" "Well, there's a hole in him, man. We need the police. Someone call Inspector Slack. And for heaven's sake, someone take that girl inside before she has hysterics." As the colonel began delegating tasks with military brusqueness, the village began to react in its own idiosyncratic wah. The village react stage of any tragedy in St. Mary Mead was a predictable yet revealing process. First came the denial, then the immediate search for a scapegoat, and finally the delicious whispered speculation. Mrs. Finch, still wearing her flour-dusted apron from the cake stall, leaned heavily against the stone wall. "I saw him not 10 minutes ago," she whispered to a huddle of wide-eyed women. "He was laughing at the tombola. Laughing? It's a judgment, that's what it is. He was always a bit too casual with his talk of the afterlife. Was Dr. Stone a judgment?" Mrs. Hartnell, the local critic of all things moral, sniffed loudly. "It's a disgrace, that's what it is. Right at the vicarage gate. During the fete. Think of the children. And he was such a healthy man. It's quite unnatu. Row. Though," she added, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial rasp, "I did hear his finances weren't what they seemed. All those expensive trips to London since his poor wife passed. Perhaps he owed money to the wrong sort." Miss Marple stood near the rose bushes, looking down at the fallen doctor with a mournful expression. She noticed that his tie was slightly askew, unusual for a man as vain as Dr. Stone, and that his right pocket seemed weighted down by something heavy and rectangular. She also noticed a very small, bright yellow thread caught on the iron latch of the gate, a colour that didn't seem to match anything the doctor was wearing. "It is all so very distressing," Miss Marple murmured to no one in particular, though she knew Mrs. Bantry was standing just behind her. "It reminds me so much of poor Mr. Gregson's prize ram. Do you remember, Dorothy? Everyone thought it was a wandering dog, but it turned out to be the shepherd's own nephew, all because of a disagreement over a bit of grazing land. People are so very much the same everywhere, aren't they?" Mrs. Bantry, used to Jane's seemingly nonsensical parallels, frowned. "Jane, dear, a doctor is hardly a ram. This is murd. In our own backyard." "Indeed," Miss Marple sighed, her eyes drifting toward the curate's wife, Mrs. Davies. The young woman was standing perfectly still, her face a mask of frozen porcelain. She wasn't looking at the body at all. She was looking at the ground, her foot restlessly tracing a circle in the dirt. Miss Marple noted that the young woman's husband, the curate, was nowhere to be seen. He'd been there just moments before the scream. The air began to thicken with theories, each more elaborate than the last. Some spoke of a madman hiding in the woods, a convenient phantom that usually appeared in the village imagination whenever something went wrong. Others whispered about foreign agents, a popular theory given the recent headlines in the papers. But Miss Marple knew better. Evil was rarely a stranger from the woods. It was almost always someone you had tea with on Tuesdays. As the distant wail of a police siren began to climb the hill toward the village, the crowd began to pull back, though they didn't disperse. They stood in small, whispering clusters, their eyes darting toward one another with newfound suspicion. The warmth of the afternoon was gone, replaced by a cold, prickling distrust. The fete was over, but the real drama had only just begun. Miss Marple watched the vicarage door. It remained closed, but a curtain on the upper floor flickered. Someone was watching from above, and they were watching with a very particular kind of intensity. Inspector Slack arrived with all the subtlety of a steam engine, his face set in its habitual expression of harass. efficiency. He was a man who believed that if one rushed about sufficiently and spoke in a sharp enough tone, the truth would eventually be intimidated into revealing itself. To Slack, the village of St. Mary Mead was a nest of irritatingly vague witnesses and elderly ladies with too much time on their hands, and he viewed the presence of Miss Marple with a particular weary dread. He marched across the grass, his boots crunching on the gravel, and immediately began barking orders at the local constable, P.C. Pork, who was looking rather green about the gills while guarding the gate. Miss Marple had not moved far. She had retreated to the shade of a large cedar tree, where she was once again busily engaged with her knitting. To the casual observer, she was merely a frail old lady recovering from a shock. In reality, she was positioned perfectly to observe the arrival of the authorities and the subsequent reactions of the primary residents of the vicarage. She watched as Slack knelt beside the body of Dr. Stone, his movements brisk and clinical. The doctor's body was eventually shielded by a screen, and the grim business of the formal investigation began. "Now then, Vicar, Slack." His voice carried clearly across the lawn. "Who was the last person to see the doctor alive? And I don't mean from 100 yards away at the coconut shy. I mean close up." Mr. Clement, looking weary and older than his years, rubbed his forehead. "It is hard to say, Inspector. The fate is a chaotic affair. I believe I saw him speaking with Mrs. Davies near the refreshment tent about 20 minutes before the incident, and Colonel Armstrong was arguing with him earlier about a matter of the parish council, but that is hardly unusual." Miss Marple's needles clicked. She remembered that argument. It had been about the preservation of the old footpath, a trivial matter on the surface, but the Colonel's face had been dangerously red, and the doctor had been uncharacteristically mocking. It reminded her of old Mr. Bedloe and the village blacksmith, a disagreement over a garden fence that had ended in a very nasty case of arson. People often used small grievances as a funnel for much larger resentments. As the sun began to dip lower, casting long skeletal shadows across the lawn, the inspector began his preliminary interviews in the vicarage study. Miss Marple, through the open window, could catch snatches of the proceedings. She saw the curate, Mr. Davies, finally emerge from the direction of the church. He looked dishevelled, his collar slightly wilted, and his explanation for his absence, meditating in the vestry, was delivered with a stutter that Slack clearly found suspicious. "Meditating, eh?" Slack's voice was audible through the glass. "For 45 minutes? While a murder was happening right outside the gates. Bit convenient, wouldn't you say, Mr. Davies?" Miss Marple shook her head slightly to herself. Slack was looking for a guilty look, which was a very dangerous thing to do. In her experience, the truly guilty often looked remarkably innocent, while the innocent frequently looked guilty out of sheer nerves or a sense of social inadequacy. Poor Mr. Davies was a man who would look guilty if he had accidentally taken the wrong umbrella from a stand. She turned her attention to the fringes of the crowd that still lingered by the wall. Jasper Thorne, the artist, was leaning against a tree, sketching in a small pad. It seemed a macabre occupation given the circumstances. Miss Marple drifted toward him, her footsteps silent on the grass. "A very tragic day." "Mr. Thorne," she said softly, coming to a halt beside him. Thorne didn't look up immediately. "Tragic, I suppose so, or perhaps just inevitable. Life has a way of balancing the scales, Miss Marple. Dr. Stone was a man who lived loudly. It's only fitting he should leave the stage with a bit of a bang. A very cynical view for a young man," she replied gently, her eyes resting on his sketch. "It wasn't a drawing of the scene, but a series of sharp, jagged lines that seemed to capture the tension of the crowd. You didn't seem particularly surprised when the scream went up." Thorne finally looked at her, his dark eyes narrowed. "I've spent a lot of time in cities, Miss Marple. Screams are just part of the ambient noise there. It takes more than a village tragedy to rattle my nerves." "I see," she murmured. "It is a gift, I suppose, to remain so detached, though detachment can sometimes be mistaken for something else entirely." She moved away before he could respond, her mind turning over the small details she had noted earlier. The yellow thread on the gate, the heavy object in the doctor's pocket, and most importantly, the behaviour of the doctor's own nurse, Miss Casewell, who had arrived on the scene 10 minutes after the body was found. While everyone else had been focused on the blood and the horror, Miss Casewell had been staring, not at the doctor, but at the Colonel's wife, Lady Carmichael. And Lady Carmichael had looked away with a flash of unmistakable loathing. Miss Marple sat back down on her bench, the twilight deepening around her. To the police, it was a matter of footprints, ballistics, and timelines. To Jane Marple, it was a matter of character. She thought of Dr. Stone's recent trips to London. She thought of the curate's missing 45 minutes. And she thought of the way the sun had reflected off something metallic in the upper window of the vicarage just seconds before the shot, or what sounded like a shot, had been fired. The investigation was beginning to swirl into a vortex of accusations and alibis. But Miss Marple remained still. She was waiting for the village to start talking. In St. Mary Mead, the truth was never shouted, it was whispered over garden hedges and through the steam of teacups. She merely had to be there to catch it. By the following morning, the morning dew had barely evaporated from the vicarage lawn before Inspector Slack had firmly settled on his first primary suspect. To Slack, the case possessed a beautiful linear simplicity that required none of the intuition or human nature that Miss Marple so often alluded to. The curate, Mr. Davies, was the perfect candidate for a man driven to a desperate act. He had no alibi for the crucial window of time. He was visibly agitated and, as Slack had discovered, rough a few pointed questions at the local pub. He had been seen in a heated discussion with Dr. Stone only 2 days prior regarding the doctor's perceived lack of respect for church traditions. Miss Marple, meanwhile, was sitting in her small, neat garden, ostensibly tending to her sweet peas, though her ears were tuned to the rhythmic clicking of the garden gate. She knew that before the hour were out, someone would arrive with the latest developments. It was Mrs. Price Ridley who eventually appeared, her face flushed with the exertion of carrying such a heavy burden of news. She didn't even wait to reach the porch before she began speaking. "They've practically arrested him, Jane, poor Mr. Davies. They say the inspector found a revolver in the vestry tucked right behind the old hymn boo. Case. Can you imagine? A man of the cloth. Of course, I always said there was something a bit unstable about him, that nervous twitch of his and the way he never looks you directly in the eye when he's delivering a sermon. It's always the quiet ones, isn't it?" Miss Marple snipped a withered leaf with her garden shears. "A revolver in the vestry. That does seem a bit theatrical, doesn't it, Marth? Like something out of one of those dreadful novels young people read nowadays. If one were going to hide a murder weapon, the church vestry is the first place a policeman would look. It's almost as if it were put there to be found." Mrs. Price Ridley bristled slightly. "The inspector seems very satisfied. He says the motive is as clear as day, professional jealousy, or perhaps something to do with that young wife of his. People are saying she was seen leaving the doctor's surgery late at night last week, looking very distressed indeed. If the curate found out, well, a man's temper can be a frightening thing." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, though her mind was elsewhere. She was thinking of Mr. Penlyn, the village grocer many years ago, who had been accused of stealing from the till. One was certain it was him because he looked so miserably guilty every time the accounts were checked. It turned out he wasn't stealing at all. He was simply terrified of being accused because his father had been a thief. The real culprit had been the most cheerful, confident girl behind the counter, who had used the money to buy silk stockings. "The police are very eager to close the case," Miss Marple said gently. "It is comforting for the village to have a villain identified so quickly, but I cannot help but think of the timing. To kill a man at a public fete, with hundreds of witnesses nearby, suggests either a complete loss of sanity or a very clever piece of misdirection. Mr. Davies may be nervous, but he is not a fool." After Mrs. Price Ridley had hurried off to spread her thea. Eyes elsewhere, Miss Marple remained in her garden. She was recalling the exact moment of the scream. She remembered where everyone had been standing. Most importantly, she remembered the expression on Lady Carmichael's face. It hadn't been shock. It had been a cold, stony satisfaction that had vanished in the blink of an eye, replaced by a socially acceptable mask of horror. Later that morning, Mrs. Marple found herself walking toward the village square, her basket on her arm. She happened to pass the artist Jasper Thorne, who was sitting on a stone wall, watching the police car parked outside the vicarage with a mocking smile. "The hounds have found their fox," Thorne remarked as she approached. "Slack is looking very pleased with himself. I saw him marching the curate across the Launier." Relier. "It was quite a Victorian melodrama. The inspector is a very energetic man," Miss Marple replied. "But energy is not always the same as accuracy. Tell me, Mr. Thorne, as an artist, you must be very sensitive to light and shadow. Did you happen to notice anything unusual about the vicarage windows yesterday afternoon, just before the tragedy?" Thorne's smile faltered for a fraction of a sec. Windows. "I was focused on the crowd, Miss Marple. The movement, the colour. Why do you ask?" "Oh, just an old woman's fancy," she said brightly. "I thought I saw a flash of light from the upper floor. I wondered if someone might have been taking a photograph, or perhaps it was merely the sun reflecting off a mirror. It's curious how the mind seeks patterns where there are none." Thorne watch. Her go. His eyes narrowed. Miss Marple felt his gaze on her back, a prickling sensation that confirmed her suspicion. The artist was far more observant than he let on, and his detachment was a shield, not a personality trait. As she continued toward the shops, she encountered Miss Casewell, the doctor's nurse. The woman looked exhausted, her usual professional briskness replaced by a hollow-eyed weariness. She was carrying a small valise, as if preparing to leave. "Leaving us so soon, Miss Casewell?" Miss Marple asked kindly. "There's no work for me here now," the nurse replied, her voice flat. "The doctor is dead, and his affairs are a mess. I'm going back to London to find a new post." "A great loss," Miss Marple murmured. "He was a man with many secrets, I imagine. A doctor often is. Hey, see the things we try to hide from the rest of the world." Miss Casewell looked at her sharply. For a moment it seemed she was about to speak, to pour out some hidden truth, but then she tightened her grip on her valise and hurried away without another word. Miss Marple watched her go, noting the way the woman's shoulders were hunched, as if she were carrying the weight of the entire village. Secrets. The police had their suspect, their weapon, and their motive, but as Miss Marple looked at the yellow thread she had retrieved from the gate, now tucked safely in her pocket, she knew that Inspector Slack was chasing a ghost, while the real killer was still walking the streets of St. Mary Mead, waiting for the dust to settle. The afternoon sun began to lose its aggressive heat, casting a golden, deceptive glow over the village. As Miss Marple made her way toward the vicarage once more, Inspector Slack had retreated to the local station to finalize his report on the curate's inevitable guilt, leaving the crime scene guarded only by the heat and the heavy scent of crushed grass. Most people would have seen a tragedy concluded, but Jane Marple saw only the beginning of a very different story. She requested a brief word with the vicar's wife, Griselda, who was far more perceptive than her husband, and currently much more distressed. As they sat in the darkened parlour, sipping tea that had grown cold, Miss Marple's eyes wandered to the mantelpiece, then to the floor, and finally back to the garden gate, visible through the window. She wasn't looking for bloodstains or fingerprint. She was looking for a breach in the social fabric. "Griselda, dear," Miss Marple said softly, "I noticed something yesterday that has been puzzling my old brain. When the poor doctor fell, I noticed a very small, bright yellow thread caught on the iron latch of the gate. It was a peculiar shade, almost a canary yellow. I don't recall seeing anyone at the fete wearing such a vibrant colour." "Do you?" Griselda frowned, her mind racing through the sea of floral prints and beige linens that usually populated a village gathering. "Yellow? No, Jane, it was all very subdued. Even that artist, Mr. Thorne, was in his usual drab greys. Why would a thread matter? The inspector found the gun after all. He says the case is practically closed." Miss Marple smiled a little sadly. "The inspector is very fond of things that close. but life, I've found, is often left ajar. That thread was silk, Griselda. Very expensive silk. Not the kind of thing one wears to a dusty village fete, unless one is trying to make a very specific impression, or perhaps if one had changed clothes very quickly. She stood up, her joints protesting slightly, and moved toward the hallway. On a small table near the door sat a collection of lost property from the previous day's festivities, a child's toy, a lonely glove, and a small rectangular silver case that had been found near the rose bushes. The police had already dismissed it as a cigarette case belonging to the doctor, which was consistent with his habits. However, Miss Marple picked it up with a gloved hand, turning it over. It was indeed a cigarette case, but as she pressed the catch, she noticed a tiny indentation on the inside of the lid, a mark that didn't come from a cigarette, but rather looked like the impression of a small, sharp key. "It's funny," Miss Marple murmured, "how we see what we expect to see. The inspector saw a doctor's cigarette case. I see a container for something much more valuable than tobacco." She excused herself and walked into the garden, heading not for the gate where the body had lain, but for the potting shed at the far end of the vicarage grounds. She remembered seeing the curate's wife, Mrs. Davies, hovering near this shed just minutes before the alarm was raised. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and fertilizer. Miss Marple began to poke around the back of the workbench with her umbrella. There, tucked behind a bag of bone meal, she found what she was looking for, a discarded pair of gardening gloves. They were unremarkable, except for the fact that the right glove was stained with something that wasn't mud or plant juice. It was a dark, oily residue, the kind of grease one might find on the moving parts of a high-quality, precision instrument. This was the hidden clue that Chang. Everything. To Inspector Slack, the curate was the killer because the gun was in his church. To Miss Marple, the presence of precision oil in a gardening shed, a yellow silk thread on a gate, and a hidden key mark suggested a level of premeditated theatre that the curate was simply too honest to perform. The oil suggested a weapon that had been meticulously maintained, not a dusty old revolver. Hidden behind hymn books, she stepped out of the shed and saw Colonel Armstrong walking briskly down the lane. He looked troubled, his jaw set in a hard line. He paused when he saw her, tipping his hat with a jerky, nervous motion. "Still poking about, Miss Marple? Best leave it to the professionals. Slack has his man." "Best for the village to move on. Movement is important, Colonel," she replied, with a sharp twinkle in her eye. "But moving in the wrong direction can be quite a waste of energy. Tell me, do you still keep that collection of antique dueling pistols in your library? I remember your late father was quite proud of them. They required such specific oil to keep the mechanisms from seizing in the damp English air." The Colonel's face went from its usual ruddy tan to a pale, sickly grey. He opened his mouth to speak, then seemingly thought better of it, turned on his heel, and marched away without a word. Miss Marple watched him go, her suspicions hardening into a cold certainty. The clue wasn't just the thread or the oil, it was the reaction to them. She sat back down on her bench by the gate, the very spot where the tragedy had unfolded. She realized now that the murder hadn't been an outburst of passion or a simple dispute over a footpath. It was a surgical strike, timed to the second, designed to use the village's own prejudices as a smokescreen. The obvious suspect had been served up like a sacrificial lamb, while the real killer relied on the fact that no one would look twice at an overlooked detail. But they had forgotten one thing. Jane Marple had spent 20 years looking twice at everything. The following morning, St. Mary Mead felt less like a quaint village and more like a pressure cooker. The arrest of the curate had not brought the peace inspector Slack had promised. Instead, it had acted as a catalyst, loosening tongues and stirring up old sediment that had long lain dormant at the bottom of the village's social pool. Miss Marple, mindful of the brewing storm, decided that a series of polite afternoon calls was in order. In her experience, the truth was rarely found in a direct confrontation, but was often glimpsed in the peripheral vision of a casual conversation about knitting or rose pruning. Her first stop was the home of Lady Carmichael. The great house was draped in a funereal silence, the heavy velvet curtains drawn against midday sun. When Miss Marple was shown into the drawing-room, she found Lady Carmichael not in mourning, but in a state of icy, controlled fury. The woman was pacing the length of the Persian rug, her fingers twisting a lace handkerchief into a tight cord. "It is a tragedy, Jane, of course," Lady Carmichael said, her voice brittle, but the man was a menace. Dr. Stone had a way of reaching into people's lives, of finding things that were meant to stay buried. He called it modern medicine. I call it blackmail. He had no business poking into the Carmichael estate's history, or my husband's health for that matter. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes mild. "A doctor does see a great deal. It is a burden of the profession. It reminds me of the old apothecary in my aunt's village." He knew exactly who was watering down their milk and who was visiting the tavern far too often. He died quite suddenly too, tripped over his own cellar stairs, or so they said, though my aunt always noted that the stairs had been freshly waxed that very morning by his heir. Lady Carmichael's eyes flashed. "Are you suggesting something, Jane? Because if you are, you should know that my husband was with me in the refreshment tent the entire afternoon. There were a dozen witnesses." "Oh, I'm sure there were," Miss Marple replied gently. "The Colonel is a man of great presence. It is hard to miss him, but I was actually thinking of Miss Casewell. She seemed quite preoccupied with you yesterday. One might almost say she was looking for a sign of recognition. Had you met her before she came to the villa?" "GE as the doctor's nurse?" The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Lady Carmichael turned her back to the window. She was a distant relations ward. A common girl with an uncommon memory for grievances. If she has been whispering in your ear, Jane, I suggest you take it with a grain of salt. Leaving the great house, Miss Marple directed her steps toward the small cottage rented by J. Asper Thorne. The artist was in his garden, but he wasn't sketching. He was burning papers in a small rusted incinerator. The smoke smelled of expensive vellum and chemical ink. He didn't look up as she approached the fence. "You're a very curious woman, Miss Marple," he said, tossing another handful of documents into the flames. "Most people are hiding in their homes, afraid of the killer curate. But you're out here collecting secrets like a magpie." "I have always found that secrets are like weeds, Mr. Thorne. If you don't pull them up by the roots, they eventually choke the garden. I couldn't help but notice that you and Mrs. Davies, the curate's wife, seemed to share a very particular look when the inspector led her husband away. It wasn't pity I saw in your eyes, it was relief." Thorne laughed, a sharp, unlovely sound. "Elsa Davies is a woman who deserves better than a life of parish teas and vicarage damp." Stone knew that. He was treating her, as he put it, but his treatments involved a lot of questions about her inheritance and why a girl of her beauty was wasting away in a village like this. He was a predator, Miss Marple. He didn't just want her money, he wanted the power that came with knowing why she really married Davies. "And why did she marry him?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Because he was the only man who didn't ask questions," Thorne replied, his eyes fixed on the dying embers. "He offered her a sanctuary. Stone was going to blow that sanctuary apart. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have more memories to incinerate," as Miss Marple walked back toward her own cottage. The pieces of the puzzle began to shift into a new, more sinister alignment. It wasn't just one motive, it was a tangle of them. The Colonel had been protecting a reputation, Lady Carmichael was silencing a ghost from her past, the artist was protecting a woman who might have been more than a muse, and the nurse, Miss Casewell, held the keys to all of it. The curate was merely the convenient focal point, a man whose very goodness made him a perfect screen for someone else's calculated evil. Miss Marple realized that Dr. Stone hadn't just been murdered, he had been executed by someone who viewed him as a malignant growth that needed to be removed for the health of the village social body. She thought again of the yellow silk thread. It was so out of place, so feminine, and yet so bold. It wasn't the color of a murderer's heart, but perhaps it was the color of a murderer's vanity. She remembered where she had seen that exact shade before. It hadn't been on a dress or a scarf, It had been in a small embroidered frame in the doctor's own waiting room, a piece of needlework that had been a gift from a grateful patient. The morning of the third day after the tragedy brow, a development that threatened to turn the village's collective certainty into a frantic, disjointed panic. Just as Inspector Slack was preparing to transfer the curate to the county jail, a discovery was made that shattered the neat timeline he had constructed. Mrs. Bantry, out for an early walk to clear her nerves, had found a discarded silk scarf tangled in the brambles of the footpath leading away from the vicarage. It was not just any scarf, it was a vibrant canary yellow silk, and it was wrapped tightly around a small, empty glass vial labelled with the doctor's own pharmaceutical stamp. The news swept through St. Mary Mead like a gale. Within an hour, the theory of the shooting was being rapidly superseded by the terrifying prospect of poison. Dr. Stone's body, it was revealed, a leaked word from the morgue, had not just a puncture wound but signs of a swift, systemic collapse. The inspector, rather than feeling chastened by this new evidence, pivoted with his usual aggressive agility. He now declared that the curate must have been poisoning the doctor over time and used the fate as a final dramatic distraction to deliver a fatal dose before staging a mock shooting. With a blank cartridge found in the vestry, Miss Marple, hearing this latest turn of events while purchasing a pint of cream at the grocer's, felt a deep cold ripple of concern. This new clue was far too convenient. It was as if the killer, realizing the first trail of breadcrumbs was being scrutinized too closely by a certain elderly lady, had dumped an entire loaf of bread on a different path. She knew the yellow silk scarf belonged to Miss Casewell. She had seen the nurse wearing it in a photograph tucked into the mirror of the doctor's surgery. "It's quite clear now, isn't it?" Mrs. Hartnell proclaimed, to the shop at large, her voice ringing with grim satisfaction. That nurse and the curate were in it together, a classic conspiracy. She had the access to the drugs and he had the motive to rid himself of a rival. I always said that woman was too quiet to be honest, and that scarf, yellow, it's the colour of deceit. Miss Marple paid for her cream and walked out into the bright morning air, her mind working with the precision of a clockmaker. The scarf was meant to implicate Miss Casewell, just as the gun had been meant to implicate the curate. But if everyone was being framed, who was the artist behind the canvas? She detoured toward the vicarage gate once more, standing at the exact spot where the yellow thread had been caught. She closed her eyes, reconstructing the scene of the fate. She remembered the colonel's wife, Lady Carmichael, sitting under the refreshment tent. She remembered the colonel's nervous checking of his watch. But there was a third person in that family dynamic that she had overlooked, the colonel's young ward, a distant cousin named Sylvia, who had recently returned from a finishing school in Switzerland and had been remarkably quiet throughout the entire ordeal. Sylvia had been seen near the gate just moments before the scream, carrying a tray of lemonade. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a sleek black car, not police, but a private vehicle. Out stepped a solicitor from London, a man named Mr. Enderby, who looked as though he had been carved from a piece of old mahogany. He headed straight for the Carmichael estate. Miss Marple followed at a discreet distance, her pace brisk. She managed to intercept him as he paused to consult a map near the village green. "Forgive me," Miss Marple said, her voice at its most fluttery and harmless. "Are you looking for the Carmichael house? It's just up the lane. Such a terrible time for them, with the doctor's passing. He was so very close to the family, wasn't he? Almost like a legal advisor as well as a physician." Enderby looked at her over his spectacles, his expression guarded. "Dr. Stone was indeed involved in certain family matters, madam, though saw might be a generous term. He was more of a witness to a certain will that was due to be amended this very week." "A will?" Miss Marple's eyes widened. "How very interesting. I suppose it's a good thing the Colonel is such a robust man, or there might be all sorts of complications, especially with young Sylvia coming of age soon." Enderby's mouth tightened. "The amendment concerned the war. Dee's inheritance, yes, but since the doctor is deceased and the second witness, the nurse, is currently under a cloud of suspicion, the previous will stands. It's a messy business." Good day to you." He hurried off, leaving Miss Marple with a final chilling piece of the puzzle. The motive wasn't just old secrets or professional jealousy, it was a vast amount of money that was about to be redirected. And Dr. Stone had held the power to ensure that redirection happened. By killing him and framing both the curate and the nurse, the killer was not just removing a threat, but ensuring that the only people left to manage the fortune were the Carmichaels themselves. But there was still the matter of the yellow scarf. Why leave it so late? Why wrapped around a vial? Miss Marple realized with a jolt of clarity that the twist was a secondary layer of protection. If the gun failed to convince the world of the curate's guilt, the poison would surely finish the job of destroying the nurse's credibility. It was a double-pronged attack on two innocent people to protect one very guilty secret. She turned and headed toward the back entrance of the Carmichael stables. She needed to see the Colonel's collection of antique pistols one more time, but she didn't want to ask for permission. She knew that the true killer didn't just use a weapon. They used a personality, and the Colonel's personality was a fortress of tradition that was beginning to show cracks. As she approached the outbuildings, she saw the artist, Jasper Thorne, watching her from the shadow of a tree. He didn't speak, but he said his sketchbook in a silent salute. He knew she had seen through the deception, and he was waiting to see if she would survive the revelation. The afternoon sun began to dip, casting long skeletal fingers of shadow across the lawn of the Carmichael estate. Miss Marple, clutching her knitting bag as though it were a shield, walked with a deliberate, fragile gait up the gravel drive. She did not approach the front door with the confidence of a social equal, but rather with the hesitant air of an elderly lady seeking a small favor. She found Colonel Armstrong sitting on the terrace, a glass of brandy at his elbow despite the early hour. He looked older, his face a map of deep-set lines and a greyish pallor that no amount of sun could warm. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice a gruff rasp, "I should think the village has had enough excitement for 1 week. Surely you aren't here to discuss the latest gossip? I hear Slack has found more evidence against that unfortunate nurse." "Oh, it is all very confusing, Colonel," Miss Marple replied, settling herself into a wicker chair with a small sigh of relief. "My head is quite spinning with it all. Guns in the vestry, scarves in the brambles. It's like a very disorganized game of hide and seek. But I actually came to ask your advice on something much more mundane. It's about my nephew's collection of old watches. He has one that has stopped, a very fine Swiss movement, and he told me it requires a very specific type of oil. I remembered you mentioning your antique pistols and thought you might know the name of the brand you use. It's so important to use the right lubricant for precision instruments, isn't it? Otherwise the mechanism might fail at the most critical moment." The Colonel's hand, reaching for his glass, paused for a fraction of a second, a hesitation so brief that anyone else would have missed it. But Miss Marple was watching the way his knuckles whitened. "I'm sure any local ironmonger could help you, Jane. I really haven't the time to discuss clockwork today." Of course, she murmured, her needles beginning to click. "It's just that the smell of the oil in the Vicarage potting shed was so distinctive. I happened to be there yesterday looking for a misplaced trowel, and I smelled it on a pair of discarded gloves, a very sharp metallic scent. It reminded me so much of the time old Major met. Calf used to clean his service revolver. He was a man of great precision, too. He always said that the perfect crime isn't about the act itself, but about the timing, like a theatrical performance." She looked up at him then, her blue eyes clear and unnervingly steady. "He told me once that if you want to make people look left, you must make a very loud noise on the right, a scream, for instance. Or perhaps a flash of light from an upper window, reflecting off a mirror to simulate the muzzle flash of a gun, while the real blow is delivered silently from a different direction entirely." The Colonel sat perfectly still. The only sound was the distant caw of a crow and the rhythmic click-click of Miss Marple's needles. "That is a very vivid imagination you have, Miss Marple. Almost dangerous." "Oh, I am just a foolish old woman who has lived a very long time," she said brightly, though her tone remained cold. "I have seen so many people try to protect what they think is theirs. Take poor Dr. Stone. He was a greedy man, wasn't he? He found out about the trust fund for young Sylvia, how the money was nearly gone, spent to maintain this house and pay off the Colonel's debts. He wanted his share to keep quiet. He was going to wait until the solicitor arrived to make a formal record, a very inconvenient man. But the cleverest part, I think, was the yellow thread. It was such a feminine touch. It made everyone look for a woman. It made us think of the nurse, or the curate's wife, or even Lady Carmichael. She paused, dropping a stitch, and leaning forward to pick it up. But then I remembered something. I remembered seeing you at the flower show 3 years ago. You were wearing a very handsome silk boutonniere, a canary yellow rose. You told me then it was a family tradition, a bit of silk from your grandmother's wedding dress that you had made into small tokens for good luck. You were wearing it on your lapel the day of the fete, weren't you, Colonel? But when I saw you after the scream, it was gone. I imagine it caught on the gate latch when you leaned over to ensure the doctor was truly silenced after his fainting spell, which was of course the result of a very small, very potent sedative delivered in his lemonade. The Colonel's breathing had become shallow. He didn't look at her. He looked out over the gardens he had killed to keep. You have no proof of any of this. It's all grandmother's tales and scraps of silk. The proof is in the gloves, Colonel, she said softly. The ones in the potting shed. They have the oil from your dueling pistols, and they have a very small smear of the doctor's blood. You see, when you stepped out of the shadows to finish the work the sedative had started, using that beautiful, silent antique blade, you forgot that silk cat. Chaise. And you forgot that even in a village as quiet as St. Mary Mead, there is always someone watching who understands that human nature is the most reliable evidence of all. The Colonel stood up slowly. For a moment, Miss Marple wondered if he would reach for her throat, but the fire had gone out of him. He looked like a man who had been playing a high-stakes game of bridge and had finally seen the winning hand held by an opponent he had utterly dismissed. He turned and walked toward the house, his gait heavy and defeated. Miss Marple didn't follow. She sat in the fading light, her knitting finished, waiting for the sound of the telephone in the hallway. She had played her part. Now she simply had to wait for the final curtain to fall. The drawing room of the vicarage was crowded, yet a heavy, suffocating stillness reigned. Inspector Slack stood by the fireplace, looking remarkably smug as he adjusted his cuffs, convinced he was minutes away from a formal confession from the curate. Mr. Davies sat with his head in his hands while his wife Elsa stood behind him like a marble statue. Lady Carmichael and the Colonel occupied the settee, the Colonel's face a rigid mask of military discipline. Jasper Thorne leaned against the doorframe, his sketchbook for once forgotten, and Miss Casewell sat in the corner, her eyes red-rimmed from a night of questioning. It was into this tableau of misery that Miss Marple entered, her knitting bag clutched firmly in her hands. "Inspector," she began, her voice small but carrying a strange weight that silenced Slack's impending lecture. Ely must apologize for the interruption, but I believe there has been a most unfortunate misunderstanding regarding the sequence of events at the fete. You see, we have all been looking at a very clever stage play, and we have been applauding the wrong villain." Slack exhaled a sharp, impatient breath. "Miss Marple, we have the weapon, we have the motive, and we have the suspect in custody. This isn't the time for village anecdotes." "But that is exactly what it is time for, Inspector," she replied, moving to the center of the room with a surprising grace. "Human nature is remarkably consistent. When I saw the curate's revolver in the vestry, I was reminded of old Mr. Gabbridge, who once tried to hide a stolen ham in the village well. It was far too obvious an effort to be genuine. A man, like Mr. Davies, if he were to commit a crime, would be so consumed by guilt he would likely hand the weapon to you with a formal apology. He would never hide it behind hymn books, as if he were a character in a cheap thriller." She turned her gaze toward the Colonel, whose eyes were fixed on a point on the far wall. "The crime we witnessed was not one of passion, but of cold financial necessity. Dr. Stone was a man of expensive tastes and very little moral fibre. He had discovered that the Carmichael estate was a hollow shell. The money intended for young Sylvia had been systematically siphoned away to cover the Colonel's gambling debts, and the upkeep of a lifestyle he could no longer afford. The doctor intended to blackmail the colonel, and he chose the day of the fete to demand his furs. Payment, knowing the solicitor would be arriving shortly to settle the girl's accounts. A low murmur broke out, but Miss Marple continued, her voice gaining strength. The murder was a masterpiece of misdirection. The shot we all heard was not a shot at all. It was a large firework, timed to a slow-burning fuse, placed in the upper window of the vicarage, by someone who knew exactly when the Octa would be passing the gate. The flash of light I saw was the reflection of that fuse hitting a mirror. While everyone looked up at the window, the doctor was already stumbling. He hadn't been shot. He had been drugged with a fast-acting sedative in his afternoon tea, which caused him to collapse by the gate. In the confusion that followed the bang, the killer stepped forward, ostensibly to help, and delivered the fatal blow with a very thin, very sharp antique stiletto, part of a dueling set. "That's preposterous," Lady Carmichael cried, her voice cracking. "My husband was with me." "For most of the afternoon, yes," Miss Marple said sadly. "But not for the 3 minutes following the explosion. He was the one who found the body, was he not? He was the one who told everyone to stand. Back. And it was in those seconds, under the cover of the crowd's panic, that he finished what the drug had started. But he was hurried. He was wearing his favorite canary yellow silk boutonniere, a family heirloom. As he bent over the doctor, the silk caught on the jagged iron latch of the gate. He didn't notice it at the time, but that tiny yellow thread was the first loose end of a very long rope. Inspector Slack looked from Miss Marple to the colonel, his confidence visibly wavering. "Colonel, is there any truth to this?" The colonel didn't answer. He seemed to have shrunken into his tweed jacket. Miss Marple reached into her bag and produced the stained gardening gloves she had found in the shed. "These were hidden in the vicarage potting shed, Inspector. They bear the scent of a very specific oil used for antique firearms, the same oil I smelled in the colonel's gun room, and on the palm of the right glove you will find a smear of blood that I believe will match the doctor's type." The colonel used the shed as a temporary staging ground to dispose of the gloves and the stiletto before returning to the crowd to play the role of the grieving friend. "And the scarf?" Miss Casewell asked, her voice trembling. "The yellow scarf the inspector found this morning? A second layer of deception," Miss Marple explained. The colonel realized he had lost his silk rose. He knew someone. "I'd have seen it. So he stole your scarf from the cloakroom and planted it with a vial from the surgery to suggest a conspiracy between you and the curate. He wanted to give the inspector so many suspects that the truth would be buried in the noise. It was a very brave plan, Colonel, but you forgot that even the smallest thread can pull down a heavy curtain." The silence that followed was absolute. "Oot." The colonel finally looked up, his eyes meeting Miss Marple's. There was no hatred in them, only a profound, weary recognition. He stood up slowly, smoothed his jacket, and turned to Inspector Slack. "I believe," he said with a ghost of his former authority, "that I would like to make a formal statement. Jane is quite right. It was a matter of honor, though I suppose that word has very little meaning now." As Slack led the colonel from the room, the tension finally broke. Elsa Davies began to sob, and the vicar moved to comfort his curate. Miss Marple stood quietly by the window, watching the police car pull away. She felt no triumph, only a deep, familiar sadness at the lengths to which a desperate heart would go to preserve a lie. She picked up her knitting bag, nodded a quiet goodbye to the room, and stepped out into the cooling evening air. The following week in St. Mary Mead arrived with a peculiar, heavy stillness, as if the village itself were trying to hold its breath. The colourful bunting from the summer fete had been taken down, leaving only the bare wooden poles and a few trampled patches of grass on the vicarage lawn to mark where the tragedy had unfolded. The gossy once a roaring fire, had settled into the low, persistent hum of an ember. People spoke in hushed tones at the post office, and there was a noticeable tendency for neighbours to look away when they passed the gates of the Carmichael estate. The death at the vicarage gate had become a permanent part of the local law, a dark chapter that would be whispered about for decades to come. Miss Marple sat in her garden, the late afternoon light filtering through the leaves of her apple tree. Her knitting needles were back in motion, their steady click-click providing a comforting rhythm to the quiet air. She was working on a small cardigan for a neighbour's new grandchild, the soft blue wool a stark contrast to the sharp metallic memories of the previous week. She was not alone. Mrs. Bantry had dropped by for tea, though she was uncharacteristically silent, her gaze wandering toward the distant spire of the village church. "It's the waste of it all that bothers me most, Jane," Mrs. Bantry said finally, stirring her tea with a distracted air. "The Colonel was a man of such standing, to think he would risk everything, his life, his reputation, his soul, for a trust fund and a crumbling house. It seems so very unnecessary." Miss Marple paused, her needles poised in mid-air. "It is human nature, Dorothy. A very sad part of it, I'm afraid. People often become prisoners of the image they have created for themselves. The Colonel didn't just see a house, he saw his entire identity. To lose the estate was, in his mind, to cease to exist. When Dr. Stone began to pull at the threads of identity, the Colonel reacted like a cornered animal. It is a very old story, really. It reminds me so much of poor Mr. Willoughby, the draper. He embezzled from the parish funds, not because he wanted wealth, but because he couldn't bear for his daughters to attend a ball in last year's fashions. The pride of life is a very dangerous thing, and what of the others? Mrs. Bantry asked, leaning forward. "The curate and his wife. I heard they are planning to move to a different parish. I suppose the memories here are too bitter." "Perhaps," Miss Marple murmured, "but I think they will find peace. Young Mrs. Davies has a strength she didn't know she possessed, and Jasper Thorne has left for London. He left a very beautiful sketch for the vicar, a drawing of the church at sunrise. I think he found something here he didn't expect to find. As for Miss Casewell, she has been cleared of all suspicion, though I fear she will always carry the weight of having worked for such a man as Dr. Stone. He was not a good man, Dorothy, but then, very few of us are entirely good or entirely bad. We are all just complicated." The sun began to set, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold. The village was settling into its evening routine. The shadows lengthened across the garden, reaching toward the porch. Miss Marple felt a slight chill and pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She thought of the yellow thread she had found on the gate, such a small, insignificant thing, yet it had been the undoing of a carefully constructed web of lies. It was often the way with evil, used so intently on the grand design that it neglected the smallest details. "The inspector came by this morning," Mrs. Bantry remarked, a small smile playing on her lips. "He looked rather disgruntled. I believe he's still trying to figure out how a lady who spends her time knitting could see things that his entire police force missed. He muttered something about luck and elderly intuition." Miss Marple chuckled softly, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "Let him think it is luck, dear. It is much simpler for him that way. If he realized it was merely the result of observing 70 years of village life, he would have to admit that a tea party is just as much a field of battle as any war zone. One learns a great deal about the heart while discussing the price of eggs. Or the best way to deal with greenfly." She looked out over her garden, her eyes resting on the gate. The world was a beautiful place, she reflected, but it was a beauty that lived side by side with a profound darkness. The same soil that grew her prize-winning lilies also hid the worms. Her role, she supposed, was simply to keep the garden as tidy as she could, to pull the weeds when they appear, and to ensure that the light was never entirely swallowed by the shadows. As the first star appeared in the darkening sky, Miss Marple folded her knitting and rose from her chair. The mystery of the vicarage gate was over, the accounts were settled, and the village would eventually heal. But as she walked toward her cottage, she knew that somewhere, perhaps in the next village or the next house, another story was already beginning to unfold. Human nature never rested, and neither, she suspected, would she. "Come, Dorothy," she said gently, guiding her friend toward the door. The dew is falling, and I believe there is still a little of that lemon cake left. We must enjoy the peace while it lasts." The door clicked shut behind them, and for a moment, the only sound in the garden was the evening breeze whispering through the trees, carrying away the last echoes of a crime that St. Mary Mead would never quite forget. Miss Marple had done her duty, not with a flourish of trumpets, but with the quiet, ruthless precision of a woman who knew exactly what a single yellow thread was worth.